very busy in time, exam time. So thank you so much for taking time out of your evening to join this event. This event is obviously a discussion on anti-Semitism at university, and it's part of the Lessons from Auschwitz University's project, where 4 years ago, the Holocaust Educational Trust and the Union of Jewish Students, supported by what is now known as the Department for Levelling Up Housing Communities, launched this new exciting project called Lesson for Auschwitz Universities. And in 2018, we took 120 university student leaders and staff members and SU staff members they took part in a 4-part educational program, including a 1-day visit to Auschwitz-Birkenau, with the aim of trying to tackle the rising anti-Semitism that we are seeing on campus currently. The goal of this project is to reinforce the common endeavour of students of all faiths and none, and to create a safe, inclusive and cohesive community on campus, and beyond that, and equip them with the tools needed to tackle anti-Semitism, racism and intolerance wherever they come across it. I'm delighted to say that we are able now to be running that project again in the very near future. And so we'll be looking to work with everyone on this call, universities and SUs and students up and down the country, again, taking part in this educational course and a visit to Auschwitz-Birkenau, again, with the same aims of trying to tackle the rising anti-Semitism and discrimination that we're seeing. This is just the start of this discussion. We're joined by 3 amazing speakers, Nina Friedman, the President of the Union of Jewish Students, Martin Redstone, who's the Senior Historical Advisor to the Holocaust Educational Trust, and a delegate to the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, and our special guest, Holocaust survivor, Eva Clarke. I will now invite Nina to come and speak about anti-Semitism on campus today.
Thank you very much, Bradley, and thank you to everyone for being here this evening for this event. So I have been asked to speak a little bit about anti-Semitism on campus. Can everyone see the PowerPoint? Give me a little thumbs up if we're all good. Perfect, thank you. So a bit about me and who I am and who we are first as an introduction. So the Union of Jewish Students is the representative body for over 8,500 Jewish students studying in the UK and Ireland. And within that, we cover approximately 70 Jewish societies across 70 different campuses. So we were originally founded in 1919, renamed in 1973, and today we are responsible for facilitating positive and vibrant Jewish life on campus. We are the only peer-led Jewish student organisation, and we're proudly cross-communal, so we support all Jewish students regardless of religious denomination or political affiliation. So I'm very proud to be here today on this partnership with the Holocaust Educational Trust for what is going to be a really amazing project that we're thankfully restarting after a couple of years. So I will go in a little bit into anti-Semitism in the UK. I thought I'll just zoom out first and talk about generally the rates of anti-Semitism in the UK. So all of my statistics will come from the Community Security Trust, who are an organisation in the UK that record all anti-Semitic incidents that take place towards the Jewish community. So according to their statistics, 2,255 anti-Semitic incidents were recorded in the UK in 2021. And this is an increase of 34% from the 1,684 incidents in 2020. So if you take a look at the graph on the left, you can see that unfortunately we are seeing a concerning trend where anti-Semitism has been on the rise for the past 15 plus years, and it doesn't seem to be slowing down anytime soon. And if you're wondering a bit about what constitutes an anti-Semitic incident, so if you look on the left at this diagram, we can see the different categories that come under an anti-Semitic incident. The vast majority come under abusive behavior, around 82%, and that means kind of verbal abuse being directed towards Jewish students or Jewish people, or online abuse. So that's the majority of what we see. Thankfully, not huge amounts of extreme violence, only 3 in 2021. So a lot of it is abusive behavior. And if you look on the right, we have a breakdown by month. So you can see that in the month of May, there was a massive spike in the number of anti-Semitic incidents that happened in the UK. And this was because of the conflict that was happening in the Middle East. And there's an unfortunate trend when there's a conflict in the Middle East, anti-Semitism in the UK rises significantly, and we can see that here. So zooming in now more specifically onto university campuses, we only have statistically up till 2021 because obviously this academic year hasn't concluded yet. So there were 114 total incidents in the last academic year, and this is a rise from 65 the year before and 58 the year before that. You can see in the diagram on the right that this 123, which is made up of the 58 and 65, so between 2018 and 2020, the majority again is abusive behaviour. So the trends that you see in anti-Semitism across the UK are repeated within the student community as well. And obviously the statistics show you again, there is this constant rise in anti-Semitism. It's a constant problem that Jewish students are having to face, which is really unfortunate to see. A bit more detail about where it's taking place for some of you who might be wondering. The 6 cities that had 5 or more recorded incidents were Coventry, Birmingham, Leeds, Nottingham, Bristol and Leicester, but they took place across a wide variety of campuses. And the diagram on the left will show you 51 incidents happened online and the rest happened in person. So there's a real spread, and I guess the point here is really to show you it can happen anywhere to any student in any place across the country. And the trend we see of it happening at these named universities, these cities, obviously all have big universities and they have big Jewish student populations. So there is a trend where more Jewish students, unfortunately, will equal more anti-Semitic incidents. There is a school of thought that the reason that it's higher on these campuses is because Jewish students feel more comfortable to report. As with all hate crimes, anti-Semitism is unfortunately severely underreported. And we estimate only around 20 to 30% of anti-Semitic incidents on campus are reported. And when students are in a bigger Jewish community, they feel more comfortable and confident to report. So these universities with bigger Jewish student communities, that's a potential explanation for why the numbers are higher. But yeah, we will never get a true picture of what's going on campus because the level of reporting is tragically quite low. So moving on to some specific examples, just to show you the kind of thing that happens. I've put a trigger warning here. If you don't want to see specific anti-Semitic imagery that is going around with young people, then please look away for the next couple of minutes. So it's a difficult screen to look at, but the point of this is to show you it can really happen anywhere. So there's a real mix here of incidents and where they've occurred. There is Instagram, there is TikTok, there is Twitter, there is WhatsApp. So really all social media platforms are places where Jewish students can experience anti-Semitism. Again, it can come from any level. So it can come from the peers, from your fellow students, but it can also come from academics. In the sense there's a picture of Professor David Miller. You may have heard of the incident that happened at the University of Bristol. So it can come from kind of an institutional academic level or from a peer level. And there really is no pattern that we see in anti-Semitism and where it crops up. An interesting one on the bottom left was at Essex University a few years ago, where the Jewish students at Essex tried to set up a Jewish society. And it went to a referendum and the students voted against the establishment of a Jewish society because they thought it was too political and to do with Zionism. And that was obviously really horrible for the students involved. And thankfully, the university were really good in helping them solve that. Just to the right of that, you'll see some white t-shirts. And there's a trend of white t-shirt parties which happen at universities where students will go, all wear plain white t-shirts and everyone can sign anything they want on them. There is a disturbing trend where a lot of the time there are swastikas, there is anti-Semitic, there is racist graffiti on all of these shirts. So you can see here there are explicit references to the Holocaust, the Jews deserved it, swastikas. So it's really concerning that we're so many years past this now, that these tropes and the memory of the Holocaust is still being echoed on campus today to the young 18 to 25-odd-year-olds who are just trying to study on campus. So that's just an idea of the scope of the problem, not to scare anyone, but just to say that it does exist, and anti-Semitism is most definitely still a problem today. A bit more positive, what can you do to help? So firstly, obviously, we would suggest get involved with LSAU. I think Bradley will talk more about later how you can do that, but it's an excellent project and great to do. Listen to Jewish students when they raise concerns regarding anti-Semitism, work with your local Jewish society and with us, UJS, to educate others. Be mindful of the language you're using, make sure you aren't using any microaggressions or offensive terms for Jewish people. It's not a zero-sum game, so other minorities can be advocated for at the same time. You can advocate for the Jewish community, and that those things can be done alongside one another. And also to consider intersectionality. There are Jews that are not white, there are Jews that are not straight, there are Jews that are not from the UK, and to take these intersectional identities into consideration. And finally, to adopt or advocate for the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism. So moving on nicely to Martin, who I think is going to tell us about that now.
Great, thank you, Nina, for that. I mean, that's I hope for everybody a really powerful presentation. And I think, you know, and some of the stuff that you shared there is obviously very distressing, and so clearly some of it to you personally. And I think this is, sadly, as Nina said, that, you know, anti-Semitism is an issue which is still prevalent, and sadly in recent years has become more prevalent within society, and that also means within universities. And obviously, as part of the discussion around how we deal with anti-Semitism in the UK and in other societies, IHRA has to some extent come into the sort of public spotlight over recent years. So I just wanted to first of all talk a little bit about what IHRA is. You find in this field, as in any other, there are lots of acronyms, and we always used to have to explain to lots of people, IHRA is this strange body, what it all stands for. Maybe it's a bit better known now, but even so, I think it's worth saying a little bit more about this, because there's been a lot of press coverage of IHRA and its working definition of anti-Semitism, but maybe not necessarily always explanation of what that actually means. So as Bradley said at the start, IHRA stands for the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance. Now, if you think that's a mouthful, when it was founded, it was called the International Task Force for Cooperation on Holocaust Education, Remembrance and Research. So things are getting better. And IHRA was essentially founded in 1998 at the initiative of the then Socialist Prime Minister of Sweden, Göran Persson. And effectively came into existence in 2000 at a meeting in Stockholm. Today, it has 35 countries which are full members, several other countries which are sort of associated members, and it represents countries from 5 continents. So this is a significant international body. It's essentially an intergovernmental body. So bringing together representatives from the governments of each of those member states and of associated institutions like the United Nations, UNESCO, the European Union, the Council of Europe, and various others. And it might seem a bit strange to start with, why is there an intergovernmental body dealing with Holocaust-related issues? And I think Nina touched on part of this. You know, the memory of the Holocaust, even though it is now a very long time ago, is still with us in all sorts of ways in contemporary discourse. And I think sometimes much more so in perhaps other societies than we're aware of in the UK. So, for example, we very recently had a French presidential election, and the memory of the Holocaust was an issue in that presidential election. You had 2 far-right candidates seeking to defend the record of the collaborationist French government, which handed over tens of thousands of Jews living in France to the Nazis to be murdered. One of those candidates, one far-right candidate, even saying that Vichy should be celebrated for saving the lives of Jews. So we have the memory of the Holocaust still very present, and the issues which are raised by the history of the Holocaust, including anti-Semitism, being very much, sadly, a part of contemporary political life. So what IHRA does is, as I say, it works at an intergovernmental level. So each country has a delegation which is headed by typically a diplomat or sometimes a politician. And then there's a series of, I'm reluctant to use this term about myself, but of so-called expert delegates. So people working in the fields of Holocaust education, remembrance, or research, who are there to advise the more sort of political leaders, but also to begin to share experiences, expertise, to share practice, in the hope that IRA can essentially bring about certain internationally agreed standards or guidance on dealing with certain issues. So, for example, those of you who are involved, I mean, you're all involved in education in some way or another, but particularly those of you who are involved with history, or people potentially who are, I know there's one person on this call at least who trains future teachers. If you have ambitions to be a teacher, particularly in the humanities. One of IRA's most important publications is called Recommendations for Teaching and Learning About the Holocaust. Every teacher training session that the Holocaust Educational Trust runs is essentially based on the principles set out in this document about how you teach very sensitive history, and you do so in a way which is respectful, meaningful, and insightful. And so a lot of what IRA is doing is attempting to promote international cooperation on dealing with challenging issues. And this includes creating a series of so-called working definitions. So these are documents which are intended to be used transnationally between governments and other institutions, setting out guidance on certain issues. And there are currently 4 of these working definitions. And in this country, at least, the anti-Semitism one is what has had all of the attention, but you can see that's not actually the first one. So definition of Holocaust-related materials, this is advice for archivists, for researchers and so on, as to what constitutes Holocaust-related materials that should be preserved and should be accessible to researchers. And Holocaust denial and distortion, and then more recently, a working definition of anti-Roma discrimination. Because one of IRA's other priorities, alongside the Holocaust, is the genocide against the Sinti and Roma of much of Europe that was perpetrated by the Nazis and their collaborators. It's fair to say, largely 3 of these have not been very controversial and have not had very much attention, whereas anti-Semitism has had a lot of attention. And so I just want to introduce you to this because there are a few misconceptions about this, what the document says, what it's actually there for. And as Nina said, you know, there is a strong campaign for universities and student unions to consider adopting the IRA working definition. And hopefully we can get a better understanding of why that might be. I think that the key phrase here is, in a way, not so much definition, but actually working. The purpose of this document is it's not attempting to be an academic definition of anti-Semitism. I mean, to fully define anti-Semitism would require a very long monograph, would require probably a lengthy conference where there would be quite a few disagreements. But it's a working document for all sorts of institutions, for universities, student unions, for governments, for law enforcement agencies, the judiciary, trade unions, a whole range of organizations, to give them some guidance on what can be considered anti-Semitism today. And this definition was adopted when Romania chaired IRA in 2016. And the working definition is the text in black, in bold, in the box here. And you can see the language is quite nuanced, quite cautious. I think it could be blunter, frankly, but a certain perception of Jews which may be expressed as hatred towards Jews. And I think an important point to stress here is anti-Semitism obviously is most often directed towards people who are Jewish. It doesn't have to be for it to be anti-Semitism. That's the working definition. That's pretty straightforward. But there is then within the document explanatory text as to, in a contemporary context, what might that mean? So it goes on to say, first of all, it may include the targeting of the state of Israel, particularly when people talk about Israel as synonymous with Jews or as a Jewish entity, which is how people tend to perceive Israel as a Jewish entity. But it very explicitly says criticism of Israel is not necessarily anti-Semitic. It depends on context. And I think that's the source of much of the misunderstanding which has arisen around this, because of course criticism of Israel is not inherently anti-Semitic, just as the criticism of any country or its government is not inherently racist towards the citizens of that country. It's not necessarily, it depends on context. The problem is quite often criticism of Israel is anti-Semitic. And the document goes on to give examples of how that can be. And I think it's particularly linked often to the following sentence, because all too often, I'm afraid, discourse around Israel is playing into, as Nina mentioned, age-old tropes about Jews. And often people aren't always aware they are age-old tropes, but they are age-old tropes. Particularly the idea of secrecy, conspiracy, that in some ways Jews are a threat to humanity, that Jews are to blame for everything, that Jews have secret power. And it's possible to talk about the Middle Eastern situation without saying any of those things, but all too often discourse falls into those. And you saw some of the examples which Nina showed you. So the document then goes on to explain this a little bit more, and gives a series of examples. We haven't got time to go through all this. I will actually, after I've finished, I will share the URL in the chat for this on the IRA website, so you can read the definition in full. But I think it's important to stress a couple of points. Firstly, it's not saying, although they usually are, these things are always anti-Semitic. It depends on the overall context. It is left up to institutions themselves, if they adopt this definition, to determine how they apply it and whether or not instances are anti-Semitic. But I just wanted to take some of you can see there are quite a few points here which reference Israel. And I think that's where there's been sensitivity around the debate over this definition over the years. So I just want to take a couple of examples. Firstly, two related points. And as Nina said, it's sadly all too evident whenever there is conflict in the Middle East, always there is a spike in anti-Semitic incidents in the UK, and not just in the UK. In any Western democracy, in most European societies, you will find an increase in anti-Semitic incidents. And that links to two related tropes. Essentially, the idea that Jews are disloyal to the societies in which they live, which is an ancient trope, and also that Jews somehow collectively are all to blame for what one Jew does, other Jews are to blame for. And this is nothing new. I just want to share with you this photograph. For people who work in the field which I work in, Holocaust education and remembrance, showing someone a photograph like this, they would automatically assume this was Berlin in November 1938 in the so-called Kristallnacht pogrom, an attack on Jewish communities across Germany orchestrated by the Nazi regime. If you look at it a bit more closely, you might be able to see there are some things, a street sign, some signs above the shops written in English. This is Liverpool in August 1947. After the war, after the Holocaust, and not just Liverpool. This happened in Manchester, in Salford, and they're very different places to people who are from Manchester and Salford, in Glasgow, in London, in Leeds, all over the UK. There were attacks on Jewish businesses, Jewish homes, on synagogues, Jewish communal buildings. And this is a totally forgotten part of British history. And what was the trigger for this? In Palestine, a far-right Zionist paramilitary group had hanged 2 British intelligence officers it had captured. This was condemned by the mainstream Zionist leadership in British Mandatory Palestine itself. Nonetheless, people across Britain decided the Jews were to blame, including the Jewish shop owners of Liverpool. And so you have scenes like this. So this idea of any time anyone thinks that something that happens in Israel is the fault of or should be in any way related to Jews in the UK, is essentially anti-Semitic, because it is saying that Jews are all the same. And many Jews in the UK feel a very strong affinity to Israel. They have relatives in Israel. But it doesn't mean that they are all of the same mind. They are all of the same political movement. And even if it did, I mean, you're targeting people essentially because of what they are. And this has a very, very long history to it, both on particularly on the far right, to some extent on the far left as well, related to it. For example, if we're thinking about the rise of the Nazis in Germany, the so-called stab in the back myth, which appeared after the First World War, that the supposedly undefeated German army was betrayed by the socialists, who were really controlled by the Jews. And I apologize for the anti-Semitic caricature here. it's again this idea that there's some, in this case, there's something, this cartoon actually came from Austria, there was something un-German, un-Austrian about the Jews. Their loyalty was to other Jews, not to the host country. And then just one other example, which shows how I think often these ideas tie together in a way that people don't necessarily realize. Applying to Israel or Israelis symbols and images associated with classic anti-Semitism. With historical anti-Semitism has mutated through history. The anti-Semitism of the Holocaust was different to the anti-Semitism of the Middle Ages, different to the anti-Semitism of today. But as Nina said, there's a continuum of anti-Semitic tropes. And the blood libel, I don't know how many people have heard of this. This, I will say, this is really the sort of final point. This is a photograph from Haiti in 2010. Some of you will remember there was a terrible earthquake in Haiti in 2010, and Israel, like many other countries, sent medics, sent military personnel out to Haiti to help. And this is a medic from the Israeli Defense Forces, the Israeli military, with a girl who's obviously a survivor of the earthquake. On the back of this Israeli intervention, a Zionist blogger in the States, sorry, an anti-Zionist blogger, a YouTuber, posted a video in which he said the Israeli Defense Force was harvesting the organs of victims of the Haiti earthquake. No evidence, obviously it didn't happen, but it was out there. This was repeated in some press in the Middle East, and now former Liberal Democrat member of the House of Lords actually raised this and said that Israel had to investigate, there was a case to answer. And it's essentially a reincarnation, the idea that there is this Jewish lust for blood, for bodies, for organs, of the so-called blood libel, which is England's, and it is England, not the UK's, England's unique contribution to the history of anti-Semitism. It first appeared in Norwich in the 12th century, an idea that Jews would murder Christian children as part of their rituals for Passover. And this became a very, very widespread idea, sadly, in medieval Christian Europe. It's the sort of thing you would have thought would have disappeared centuries ago, but is still present in the 20th century. The picture on the right is again after the Holocaust. In 1946, in a city in Poland called Kielce, 42 Jews, mostly Holocaust survivors, were murdered because a teenage boy had disappeared. He'd actually run off to see his mates and didn't want to get beaten up by his alcoholic father. So he told his father he'd been abducted by the Jews. And this provoked a riot across the city. 42 people, mostly Holocaust survivors, were murdered by an angry mob because supposedly the Jews killed Christian children. And you might think, well, today that idea is not possible. Well, January 2021, the storming of the Capitol in DC. The man with the sweatshirt there wearing, if you know the symbols, know the iconography, a QAnon t-shirt. Don't investigate QAnon too far, you will go mad and you will despair about human nature. But QAnon, as some of you will be aware, is a conspiracy theory that there are these elites. Whenever people start talking about conspiracies of elites, Jews are going to be mentioned, you can guarantee it. And they are an elite conspiracy of paedophiles, including the Obamas and the Clintons and Bill and Melinda Gates and all sorts of other people. And behind it all, you get names like Rothschild and Soros. You don't have to dig too deep to find the anti-Semitic elements. And QAnon is fundamentally a repackaging of the blood libel. It's taking this basic concept, which is almost 1,000 years old, that Jews lust after the blood of Christian children, and repackaging, in this case, a sort of Trump fan fiction. And it has real world consequences. This was an attempt to subvert American democracy. And it wasn't just anti-Semites who were involved, although it's fair to say quite a lot of them were anti-Semites. And I think that's always what we have to remember. It's an unpleasant event, as you all remember. So I'll stop the sharing there. But it's always important to remember anti-Semitism is not necessarily the anti-Semitism of the Holocaust, but it doesn't have to be. It has consequences for people's lives. It's immensely distressing. I mean, Nina is incredibly courageous to put up with the crap that she gets on a daily basis. And I think all that the IRA working definition there is there for really is, it, as IRA itself says, it's a tool. It is there to help those who are in a position, particularly when dealing with hate crimes, to judge whether or not something could be considered to be a hate crime, to be considered whether it is anti-Semitic. And I very much hope for those of you who are at universities which have not yet adopted the definition that you will, as Nina said, advocate for it to be so. Because I think it's not a conspiracy against any individual, against any political party or political ideology. It has been adopted by dozens of governments across the world, endorsed by the UN, by the EU, and by many universities, student unions, even football clubs have adopted this definition. It's not a plot. I'm not being paid by Israel, nor is Nina. And so I would strongly urge you to have a read of this. I'll post you the link in a second. But even more importantly, to listen to Eva's testimony, which is the real reason why we're here this evening, and will shed some light on obviously what anti-Semitism in its worst form can lead to. So thank you very much, and enjoy Eva. It is always a treat.
Just before we get to you, and thank you so much, Martin, and thank you to Nina. We have a question
Sure.
from Bill. I'm going to ask this to you, Nina, on some strategies on trying to get the IHRA definition adopted at their uni. Do you have any suggestions?
Yeah, I mean, it will differ quite considerably uni to uni. So I'd recommend, like, I'll send you maybe in the chat my number or something so we can talk about this afterwards. But there's a variety of strategies. You can go straight to kind of the leadership of the university, the vice chancellor's office, and suggest it. Or some universities have a system of proposal where you can put it forward as kind of a motion to be accepted by the university. So it will differ campus to campus, but we have a lot of experience of getting over 100 and something universities adopting it. So I would be more than happy to help. So please be in touch and we can investigate your university specifically.
Thank you so much. We're now going to move on to our special guest, Eva. And Eva, when you're ready, please.
Okay, I will start. Good evening, everybody. Thank you very much for coming to listen to me. Try not to be too depressed by everything you've already heard. I am here, and I think my story, certainly for my mother and myself, does have a happy ending, apart from all the tragedy that happened to the family. But I hope it gives you some measure of hope. I'm here today because I'm a survivor of the Holocaust. I am a survivor, but only just, because I was born in a concentration camp right at the very end of the Second World War. But that comes right at the end of my story. And I start my story by telling you, at least, Bradley, could we please have the first photograph? By telling you a bit about my family. Now, yes, there we are. Thank you. Now, my father was German but Jewish. My mother was Czech. And this is a family photograph of my German family. And it has, as you can see, an interesting date of Berlin in 1913. So just 1 year before the start of the First World War. And, oh, I haven't got a pointer. If I point to the picture, can anybody see it? There are two adults in the photograph who are my grandparents, and their three children, those you can see, are at the base of the photograph, and my father's little boy on the right-hand side. Now, in 1933, when Hitler came to power in Germany, all those three children by then were grown up. They were all grown up and they all realized that it would be advisable to get out of Germany. And my father left Germany that year in 33. He managed to get to Prague, the capital of Czechoslovakia. He thought that was far enough to be safe. It wasn't, but if he hadn't have come to Prague, he wouldn't have met my mother and I would not be talking to you today. So next picture, please, Bradley. This is what I always call it my star photograph. I hope you might agree. This is a photograph of my parents on their wedding day. They were married on the 15th of May, 1940. Which was already under Nazi occupation of Czechoslovakia. My father had been an architect and interior designer, and when he first came to Prague, he managed to get a job working for a furniture manufacturer, and initially he was employed to build film sets at the Barrandov Film Studios. My mother had been a law student at the Charles University, but when the Germans invaded, they closed all the Czech universities. Nobody was allowed to study. So she decided she was going to try and find a job that had more sort of immediate practical use. And she decided to become apprentice to a milliner. Now, a milliner is a hat maker, and you may think that wasn't a very sensible idea. But I can assure you in the 1940s, women always wore hats. And it was the same in this country as well. Now, you may well know, you may well have heard of the Nuremberg laws. When the Germans invaded any country, they immediately imposed various rules and regulations upon Jewish people. And there are hundreds and hundreds of those rules and regulations, and they all come under the general heading of the Nuremberg laws. I will tell you of just a few to give you a few examples. First and foremost, Jewish people immediately lost their citizenship. They were no longer allowed to vote. No intermarriage was allowed between Jewish people and those of other faiths. Jewish people were immediately thrown out of the professions. They could no longer be doctors, lawyers, teachers. Jewish children were immediately expelled from mainstream schools. There was a curfew. Jews were not allowed to go out in the evening. They were, they were only allowed to go shopping at certain times of the day, invariably the late afternoon, when there would have been as little fresh produce available as possible. Jewish people were no longer allowed to keep animals. They had to hand them in. They were no longer allowed to keep their cars or their bicycles. They were no longer allowed to keep their telephones or their radios. There were no televisions. They were also forbidden to go to parks, swimming pools, theatres, concerts, cinemas. All those things were forbidden. Their lives were meant to be more and more restricted within their own communities. But because none of these restrictions in itself, at least initially, was life-threatening, people tended to think, well, if this is the worst it's going to get, we can cope with this, we can live with this. But by the same token, sometimes some people would test these restrictions, especially young people. I'm sure you've all experienced it. I know I have. If you're told, yes, if you're forbidden to do something, well, your gut reaction is to go and do it. Whether you actually do is another matter. And one day my mother decided she was going to go to the cinema despite the fact that it was forbidden. She was sitting in the cinema watching the film when the Gestapo came in, the secret police. They came in, they stopped the film, and they started to go through the audience, row by row, looking at their ID papers. And my mother was terrified because she had no idea how they would react when they got to her and when they saw the large J for Jew on her papers. And they got to about halfway through the auditorium and they stopped. But they left the cinema and they had stopped just one row in front of where my mother had been sitting. And boy, did she breathe a sigh of relief. And ever since she told me about this, I was always trying to get her to remember what on earth the film was that made her take such a risk. But it was such a frightening experience that she obviously blanked out that memory and she never remembered. But what I can tell you is that when we first came to this country and when I was safely in school trying to learn English as quickly as possible, I think my mother used to go to the cinema almost every single day. And that was fantastic light relief for her after her wartime experiences. She just had this need, it was almost like an obsession to catch up with the frivolous things of life. Now, my parents were amongst the first transports to be deported to this place called Terezin or Theresienstadt. Terezin was a garrison town before the Second World War where Czech soldiers were stationed. But when the Germans invaded, the Czech army was disbanded and the Germans turned this place into a ghetto and a concentration camp. And Jewish people from all over Europe were sent there in their thousands. Next picture, please. I tend to use a couple of drawings of Terezin because I think they are more evocative of the sort of place that it was at the time. These drawings were done secretly by professional artists who themselves were prisoners, and they were discovered after the war, quite by chance. They were discovered buried under the floorboards and in cracks in the walls. And so my parents were amongst the first to be sent to Terezin. This is November, December of 1941. And they were amongst the first because they were young, strong, and well able to work. And when families first arrived in Terezin, that is the first time that those families would have been split up. So men were sent to one part, women to another part, elderly people to another part, children to yet another part. They were able to meet up sometimes during the day, but to a large extent, they led separate lives. And when my mother arrived in Terezin, she was fortunate enough to be given a job. The jobs weren't paid or anything, but life was a bit easier if you had a job. And her job was working for the man who had the responsibility for sharing out the food. There wasn't much food there, but what there was, they tried to share out in a fair fashion. And that meant that she had access to food. When I say she had access to food, she would steal. She would steal a potato, a carrot, an onion, just something with which to make a more substantial soup. And that was literally of vital importance, because my mother at one time had to, every single day, to try to find food for 15 members of her close family every single day. That was her main worry. How on earth was she going to find enough food for all those people? And that was quite apart from the greater worry as to what on earth was going to happen to them all in the future. Now, very unusually, my parents spent 3 years in Terezin, which, as I say, was very unusual, because to a large extent, Terezin was a transit camp for the death camps, because there were various categories of people who would have been sent to their deaths quite quickly. And amongst those groups of people would have been the old, the sick, mothers with children, pregnant women, the mentally disabled, the physically disabled. They would have been sent to Auschwitz quite quickly. But because my parents were young, strong, and well capable of work, so they remained in Terezin for 3 years. That was a remarkably long, very unusually long period of time. You know, just think back in your lives, 3 years. That's a standard university course, I think, nowadays. And my mother always said luck had an awful lot to do with it. But at the end of September of 1944, their luck ran out, because it was on that day that my father was sent to Auschwitz. And incredibly, my mother actually volunteered to follow him the very next day. And the reason she volunteered to follow him was because she had no idea where he'd been sent. And being the eternal optimist, she thought, well, as they had survived 3 years up to that point, she thought, well, nothing could get any worse. Little did she know, but she thought nothing could get any worse. They would survive. But in fact, she never, ever saw my father again. And she heard from an eyewitness, a friend, quite soon after the end of the war, that my father had actually been shot dead on a death march near Auschwitz on the 18th of January, 1945. And Auschwitz was liberated by the Russian army on the 27th of January, 1945, a week later. And that is why we commemorate Holocaust Memorial Day on the 27th of January. Now, I mentioned the fact that when families first came into Terezin, the sexes were segregated, men from women. Well, in 1943, my mother discovered that she was actually pregnant. And when I was a very curious teenager, I said to her, so how come you got pregnant? You were with my father. And she replied in a very clever way. She said, well, she said, it was very, very, very dangerous. But your father and I got together secretly, as and when we could, and to hell with the consequences. End of story. But it was not the end of the story, and it had very, very serious consequences. Because to become pregnant in a concentration camp was considered by the Nazis to be a crime punishable by death. Because they were trying to murder, they were trying to annihilate every single member of the Jewish people. They couldn't prevent women coming into the camps pregnant, but the reason for the segregation was so that they could not become pregnant while there. And when the Nazis discovered that my mother and 4 other women were also pregnant, they made these 5 couples sign a document that said that when the babies were born, they would have to be handed over to be killed. Except they didn't use the word kill, they used the word euthanasia. My mother had never heard the word euthanasia. She had to go and ask somebody what it meant. In the event the other 4 babies were born, we don't actually know what happened to those families. We think they were all perished. They all perished in Auschwitz. When my brother, Jiří means George, he was born in February of 1944. He was not taken away from my parents, but he actually died of pneumonia 2 months later. And his death meant my life and my mother's life, which is a very strange thing to say, but true. Because had my mother arrived in the Auschwitz-Birkenau death camp holding my brother in her arms, she would have been sent straight to the gas chamber. But because she arrived in Auschwitz not holding my brother, and although she was pregnant again, this time with me, nobody knew. She knew, but nobody else knew, and it didn't show because it was very, very early on. So again, she lived to see another day. Next picture, please. Now, you may have seen this picture in the past. It's from the German records. This shows you a selection. And in fact, what it doesn't show you, unfortunately, there's a very long row of people at the top of the picture towards the left-hand side. And that long stream of people, they are walking to the gas chambers, to their deaths, but they don't know that. In the foreground, the longer row of people are men, the shorter row are women. And they are walking towards a group of Nazi officers where they will be selected for life or for death. And my mother distinctly remembered one of these selections where Dr. Mengele was presiding. Dr. Mengele was one of the most notorious Nazi officers. He was a medical doctor who actually specialized in appalling experiments upon sets of twins, upon pregnant women, upon babies. And my mother remembered hearing him say, "Diesmal sehr gutes Material," which means this time we have very good material in front of us, not people, units of slave labor. They did not consider the people in front of them as being human beings. Now, wait a minute. I'm not going to tell you anything specific about Auschwitz because that's what I think, all the other head staff will tell you. I will just tell you that when my mother arrived in Auschwitz with a group of young women, and they were all sent to the huts after they'd gone through a selection. Selection always meant life or death. And my mother managed to get through a selection because despite the fact she'd been somewhat malnourished the previous 3 years, she was still very strong. To give you an idea of her physical strength, when she was 14 years of age, she was school's junior backstroke swimming champion of Czechoslovakia. So that gives you an idea of her physical strength. And she always maintained that if this whole experience had to happen to her, she was at the right age, not only physically, but psychologically and emotionally. She was in her mid-20s, she was tough, she was strong. Now, the selections happened every day, and also what happened every day was called the appel. Appel means registration. Sounds like a very mild word, doesn't it? What it actually meant was that every day at 4 o'clock in the morning and 6 o'clock in the evening, everybody would have to stand outside their hut to be counted. And if the numbers didn't tally, they would just have to stand there till they did, or until there was some sort of explanation. My mother said it was very, very hard to stand stock still for hours and hours on end, regardless of the weather. And she fainted several times, and that could have been very bad news for her, but she was always so relieved to find that when she came round, to find that she was actually being held up by her friends on either side, which meant she hadn't sunk to the ground, she hadn't drawn attention to herself. Now, because my mother was still strong enough for work, she and a whole group of young women, they were sent out of Auschwitz. They were sent to a slave labor camp, to an armaments factory in a place called Freiburg in Germany near Dresden. And they were to remain in that slave labor camp for 6 months. That's from October of 44 to the end of March, the beginning of April 1945. And the end of the war in Europe was the 8th of May. And during those 6 months, my mother was becoming progressively more and more starved and more obviously pregnant, which could have been very dangerous for her. But fortunately, the Germans only realized she was pregnant when it was too late to send her back to Auschwitz, because Auschwitz had been liberated. And at the end of March, the beginning of April of 1945, that is when the Germans, realizing they were losing the war, that is when they began to evacuate the camps. They were trying to empty the camps of living witnesses as to what had been going on inside them. And this is when the notorious death marches happened. My mother wasn't on a death march, but she was put on yet another train. But this time it didn't consist of cattle trucks. This time it consisted of coal wagons, open to the skies and filthy. And my mother and about 2,000 other women were on a train like this for 17 days with no food and hardly any water. And at one stage, the train was stopped and the doors were opened and the dead bodies were thrown out, and a farmer walked by and he saw my mother. He had such a shock. My mother described herself as looking like a scarcely living pregnant skeleton. She weighed 5 stone and she was 9 months pregnant. And this farmer brought her a glass of milk. But there was a Nazi officer standing near her and he had a whip. And he raised this whip to shoulder height as if to beat my mother if she accepted the glass of milk. But he didn't. He lowered his arm. He let her have the glass of milk. She maintained that saved her life, and the train went on. Next picture, please. The train eventually arrived in this place called Mauthausen. Mauthausen itself is a beautiful village on the banks of the Danube in Austria near Linz. The concentration camp was up the very steep hill behind the village. And when my mother saw the name Mauthausen at the station, she had such a shock. Because as opposed to when she'd arrived in Auschwitz not knowing what that was, this time she knew, because she had heard about this appalling place from very early on in the war. And she reckoned that it possibly the shock provoked the onset of her labor. And she started to give birth to me on that coal wagon. She had to climb off the coal wagon unaided. She had to climb onto a cart because the prisoners who were not strong enough to walk up the steep hill to the camp, they had to get onto carts and they were pulled up by others. My mother always said that there were 3 reasons why we survived. And the first is a very chilling one. On the 28th of April, 1945, the Nazis had run out of gas for the gas chamber. Well, my birthday is the 29th. So presumably had the train arrived on the 26th or 27th, again, I wouldn't be talking to you this evening. The second indirect reason why we survived was because on the 30th of April, Hitler committed suicide. But the last and the best reason why we survived was because on the 5th of May, the American army liberated the camp. My mother reckons she wouldn't have lasted much longer. This shows you a photograph after liberation when some of the prisoners who were strong enough, they're pulling down the Nazi emblem with the eagle, with the swastika under the eagle. Now, after about 3 weeks, I better mention, the main form of torture in Mauthausen was a stone quarry where prisoners had to work all daylight hours. After about 3 weeks, when my mother was strong enough to travel, the Americans asked her if she wanted to be repatriated to Prague. She did. Oh, they think I weighed 3 pounds. A 3-pound baby nowadays put straight into an incubator. There were no incubators. Or perhaps I had the best incubator. My mother just held me all the time. So 3 weeks later, we were put on another train, an ordinary train this time. We arrived back in Prague. It was at night and it was dark. And my mother said that was the worst moment of her 3.5 years incarceration in camps, because up to that moment she'd never allowed herself to think as to what had probably happened to all the rest of the family. She just never let herself think about it. But you know, arriving at your home station, you wonder if there might be anybody there to meet you, but of course there wasn't. But nevertheless, she still had a vestige of optimism in her mind, and she thought that if any other member had survived, there was a chance that it might be one of her cousins, and indeed she had. My mother asked for somebody to give her some money to go on the tram. And we arrived at my aunt's flat, and my aunt had been in Terezin, and she had come back a few days before we came back from Mauthausen. And my aunt had even heard on the grapevine that my mother had survived and that incredibly she had a baby. My mother was a very practical woman. The first words she said to my aunt were, "We haven't got any lice." Well, we were riddled with lice and we had scabies, but she'd think we had. And the second thing she said was, "Please, could we stay for a few days to recover?" Well, we actually stayed for 3 years. And that was fantastic because we had our own family support group. It was a tiny family because we were almost the only survivors from what had been a very large extended family. And because my mother was given closure quite soon after the end of the war, when she was told of the death of my own father, so 3 years later, she was able to consider a new life and a new marriage. And she married my stepfather. His name was Karel Bergman. He was Czech, he was Jewish, but he'd escaped in 1939. He got to the UK, he joined the RAF. He was too old to be trained as a pilot, but because he spoke languages, he was made an official interpreter. And after the war, he came back to Prague to pick up the pieces of his family, most of whom had also been killed in Auschwitz. And he met my mother, whom he had known as a family friend before the war. And they decided to get married, and they also decided to leave. Because this was 1948, and that is when the communists took over, and they did not want to live under a communist regime. And so we came to this country, and although we came legally, I would like to stress, we might have come as refugees, we might have come as asylum seekers, we might have come as migrants. We arrived in this country, and my stepfather got a job quite quickly. I think the uniform probably helped. and he got a job in South Wales. And as a result, I grew up in Cardiff. Next picture, please. Now, this is many, many years later. I have 2 sons, and they have 3 now, 4 children between them. And this is my mother around the time of her 95th birthday, when everybody was visiting. And my mother could never get over the fact that she'd survived her wartime experiences, I survived, and that she ended her life at age 96 with 3 great grandchildren. Now that is my story, and I have to say it's been a complete race, but I hope you get an impression. I hope you get an impression, and if you do have any questions, I would like to answer them if I can. And thank you very much for listening.
Thank you so much, Eva, for sharing that story and your testimony. It really is powerful. I'm going to kick off with one question to you, which is, for those listening who have power to either make change on their campus, or who have positions where they might deal with discrimination that comes up, presents itself, what advice or what message would you try to send them, and try and the importance of dealing with anti-Semitism and discrimination?
Oh, that's a very big question. I don't even know if I'm qualified to answer it. It's such a big question. I mean, what I tend to say to people, I really am floored, because it has been extremely depressing, the rise in recent anti-Semitism. It really is very depressing, especially when, most people of my generation or survivors, and there are still some around, fortunately, when we thought this was all history and it couldn't happen. Well, I don't think it could happen in the same way again. But how to combat it, when children in the schools ask me, I always say, well, you go back to basics and you stand up for people. When children say to me, well, what can I do? And I say, well, if you're on the playground and you see somebody being bullied, you intervene, which takes courage. And then when you get older, you use your democratic vote, and all of that sort of thing. But I know you all know these sorts of answers. I'm sorry, I'm really stumped. I don't know how to combat it. I think to talk about it, and because it must be extremely difficult, I think, if you are at university and if you are confronted with anti-Semitism in any way, to stand up to it. But I think, there is a power in groups, and I think, as Martin might have said, or Nina, to join groups, to join like-minded people, because there is sort of safety in numbers, and it'll make you feel stronger to counteract the arguments that you get. Because I think it's very, very hard for people to do on their own. I'm sorry to sound so vague, and
that's fine.
But I genuinely don't know what else to say.
Thank you so much for that answer. It's a very hard question. One other question we've had is, do you agree or disagree with fictional Holocaust literature?
That's another very big question. It depends what it is. There have been some very good depictions, fictionalized depictions, either in books or on the screen. There've been some awful ones as well. I think you have to try to become very discriminating, and I think you also have to learn the history, because if you learn the history, then you can make a more what's the word? A more informed decision about what is good and what is bad. Because you can't generalize. You can't say that, it's all bad or it's all good. As I say, just don't ask me to pick any now. Put me on the spot, well, you might. But because there are some films which are very good, and there are some which are not so good. But I'm sure you can probably differentiate.
what was your family's experience like in Czechoslovakia after the war?
After the war, well, I must say my mother said that she, despite all the tragedy that had happened to her family, because she lost, we lost 15 members of our close family. My father, my maternal grandparents, my paternal grandmother, my German grandfather, you might be interested to know, he survived. So because my mother found my aunt and her sister, and the sister was also a survivor of Terezin, it was incredibly helpful for them to have a family support group, because my mother said that when survivors came back to Prague or to other places, and when they had absolutely nobody and nothing, she said they were sort of like flotsam. They just didn't know what to do, didn't know how to do anything. And she said a lot of people, sadly, tragically, committed suicide because they just couldn't face life with absolutely nobody to call their own. But my mother, well, she did say that apart from having her two cousins, she said that the main thing was that she had me. She said that I was her reason for living, because, until she married my stepfather, she was the only person I had. And she said that was a fantastic incentive to, to carry on. And she always did have this optimistic nature. She was very practical and very optimistic. And also, if you'll forgive the sales pitch, but any of you watching might be interested to know that in 2012, the BBC did a documentary on my mother, and it's called A Baby Born in a Concentration Camp. So if any of you would like to see and hear my mother, I suggest you watch her. She was very pleased with it, and it only takes half an hour, but I forgive the sales pitch.
And one last question, and apologies for the others who have put questions in the chat. How have you managed to assimilate your past and the tragedy of it into your current life?
Oh, none of the questions are easy, which is, I didn't expect them to be easy. Well, I think probably I just followed my mother's example. My mother, as I said, was a very practical woman, a very optimistic woman. She felt so grateful to have been given another chance at life, at family life, a home in the UK with my stepfather. And, if you asked her for a definition of herself, she wouldn't say Holocaust survivor. She would say a mother, a grandmother, and then she was very proud as a great grandmother. And yes, a Holocaust survivor. And she was very proud of the fact that she had got through it all and come out the other side. So again, I don't think I've answered the question. It's just part of my life. It's always been part of my life. It's not the whole of my life, but it's a very important part. Ever since I started speaking, which I can't believe it now, I first started speaking for the Holocaust Education Trust in, I think it was 2020. I can't believe it. And my mother had a lovely sense of humor, and she would say to me, not only did she give birth to me under the most dire of circumstances, but she said, I also gave you life after retirement. The fact that I go around schools and colleges and other groups telling her story. And also what I'd like to think is that, as all survivors who go and talk to people, is that through telling a personal story, we hope that it makes the history come alive.
Thank you so much, Eva, for answering the question, for sharing your testimony and taking your time to be with us today. That's everything for the event tonight. I want to thank everyone for taking the time out of your evenings and your to come in your busy schedules, because it's an important discussion, and this is just the start of this discussion. So thank you. The important information is that the Leicester and Auschwitz University's project will be coming back to campuses and universities all over the country. We're very excited to be taking even more people along this educational course of us and on a trip to Poland to see Auschwitz-Birkenau for themselves, and we'll be sending out details of that very soon. If anyone has any further questions, they want to email me back. please do. I think Nina has put her email as well in the chat. So thank you all and have a very nice rest of your evening.
And can I also say good luck to you all who are taking exams?
Yes, definitely. Good luck. Thank you all.
Okay. So,
Bye-bye.
okay, bye. Thanks a lot, Bradley. Nice to see you, Martin. Nice to meet you, Nina. Bye.
See you soon, Eva. Thank you all.
Thank you.